All right, this is lecture 3 of the Roaring Twenties. Today we're going to talk about the Harlem Renaissance. You guys should be familiar with the word Renaissance. Renaissance means rebirth, and you learned about it in world history, talking about Renaissance and how they had a rebirth of religion. They also had a rebirth of art and culture. Same thing here, and Harlem is the center for African American culture, and they're going to have a rebirth of culture through art and writing during the 1920s. So here we go. We're going to talk about it. The first thing is in the Great Migration from 1910 to 1920. Hundreds of thousands of African Americans moved to the north, um, partially because of the war. Factory jobs available up in the north. Same thing we talked about after the Civil War. More accepting culture up north. People are going there to get freedom and also the job opportunity. And obviously in the 1920s, people are coming back from war, and African Americans stay there. And some people are really upset about this. Some of the African Americans don't want to leave the South. It is their home. So here's some quotes about that. It says, "Some said goodbye cheerfully, others fearfully, with terrors of the unknown dangers in their mouths. Others in the eagerness for distance said nothing. The daybreak found them gone. The wind said north." Just talking about how African Americans, they loved the South. They loved being in the South, even though there was the racism. But they moved north because they knew it was what was best for them. There's two African American writers we'll talk about. The first one is Zora Neale Hurston. She's an African American writer who portrayed the poor black, unschooled Southern blacks. So she was talking about like the lower class society and the struggles they were going through to try to learn English, or not learn English, learn to read and write, to assimilate into white culture a little bit, to try to get an education, to try to get jobs, to try to get out of poverty. So she kind of showed the plight of the poorer African Americans. Langston Hughes, on the other hand, was the movement's best known poet who portrayed difficult lives of working class African Americans. So they showed different classes. These were men and women that went to work every day, they did their jobs, and they still struggled. Even though they had more of an education, they had a place in life, they had an education and a job, they still really, really struggled. Obviously, the civil rights movement is still 50 years away, so he's showing more a different culture of African Americans, or different socioeconomic level of African Americans, but still showing that they do share the same problems as those that Zora Neale Hurston talks about. NAACP, so it's founded in 1909. It's called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. We've already spoken about it. It's led by a man named W.E.B. Du Bois, and he's organized a parade of 10,000 African Americans in New York to protest social violence. Another man by the name of James Weldon Johnson, he organized legislation to help pass anti-lynching bills. Really all it's doing, it focuses primarily on African Americans, and it's basically trying to get them ahead in life, and trying to get them out from underneath the racist tendencies of our history. It's still around today. You'll still see it in the news today. When something negative happens to African Americans, then NAACP will be there, to speak on the behalf of those that are wronged. Another really important man is Marcus Garvey. He created an organization called the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and it's a more radical message of black pride. And he kind of focuses on the idea of going back to Africa. So he has a Back to Africa movement, and he encourages followers to return to Africa and throw off white colonial oppressors and build a mighty nation in Africa. So take some of the education that they had received in America and go back to Africa and throw off those French and other colonial powers that still own African land, and really try to create a great African race. His movement dwindled though because he was charged for mail fraud and he was jailed, and after that he was never really able to maintain his power. Another important part of the Renaissance is music, and there's two really famous people. Louis Armstrong, you've obviously heard of. He's most famous for his improvisations, and he played the trumpet. And he was probably the most influential musician in the era. He lasted way into the 50s, and he was, very, very influential African American artist. Another person, Duke Ellington, he's a jazz pianist who was also a composer. and he was famous for playing at the Cotton Club. And the Cotton Club was a really interesting club. It was in Harlem, and it was a club owned by whites, but only blacks worked there, and only whites were allowed to attend. So all the waiters and waitresses and musicians were all black, and only whites were allowed to attend. And it shows the appreciation for culture. It shows that whites weren't afraid of blacks. The whites didn't hate blacks, or not all whites hated blacks, and they wanted to kind of be in the culture, but they also didn't want to mingle with them on a social level. So that's why African Americans weren't allowed to actually attend the club. And that's it for the Harlem Renaissance.